My brother didn't look up from his phone when the paramedics wheeled me past him in the hallway. I was conscious enough to turn my head, conscious enough to see him standing 6 feet away, arms crossed, watching me with the flat, patient expression of a man waiting for a delayed flight. Not panic, not grief, just waiting. He stepped aside to let the gurney pass, and I caught the faintest trace of something on his face, not relief that I was alive, but irritation that I still was. That image stayed with me through the IV insertions, the blood draws, the cold press of an oxygen mask over my nose and mouth. My brother standing in that hallway, arms crossed, checking his watch. My name is Claire. I'm 32 years old. I run an e-commerce business I built from nothing over 7 years. And I know how to read numbers. I know when the math doesn't add up. And lying in that hospital bed with tubes in both arms, the math of my brother's expression was screaming at me from across the room. Something was very wrong. Not just with my body. The doctors told me it was acute liver toxicity. My levels were dangerously elevated, consistent with ingesting a concentrated dose of something over a period of days. They asked me about alcohol, about supplements, about any new medications. I told them I didn't drink. I told them the only thing I'd consumed differently in the past 2 weeks was the herbal tea my brother had been leaving on my kitchen counter. A thoughtful gesture, he'd said, since I'd been stressed about the business. He'd read somewhere that it helped with cortisol. He'd been so attentive about it, asking every morning if I'd had my cup. The attending physician's face didn't change when I told him that. But he excused himself from the room very quickly. My brother's name is Derek, and he is 4 years older than me and has been broke for 3 of those years. Our mother died 8 months ago and left her estate divided between us. The house went to him, the investment portfolio, and her savings went to me. It was her way of trying to be fair. She knew Derek couldn't be trusted with liquid assets. She knew I would manage them carefully. What she didn't anticipate was that Derek would look at my half and decide it was also his. I didn't know any of this while I was still in the hospital. What I knew, lying in that bed on the 3rd morning, was that my body felt like it had been wrung out and left on a clothesline, and that my brother had visited exactly once to ask me where I kept my spare house key. I told him I didn't remember. I watched his jaw tighten and I said I was sorry. The medication was making me foggy. He smiled at me with his teeth and said, "Of course. No rush. Get some rest." He was gone in under 4 minutes. My business partner, Gwen, came that afternoon. She sat beside my bed with her laptop open and a look on her face I had never seen before. And she told me that 2 wire transfers had gone out of my business account in the past 72 hours. Combined total, $61,000. Both transfers had been authorized using my digital signature. Both had landed in an account she didn't recognize. I asked her to pull up the authorization timestamps. The first transfer had gone through at 11:14 on a Tuesday night. I had been unconscious and intubated at 11:14 on a Tuesday night. The second had been processed the following morning at 9:47. I had been having a CT scan at 9:47. Someone had used my credentials to move $61,000 while I was physically incapable of using a computer. I lay back against the pillow and stared at the ceiling tiles and felt something cold and very precise settle over me. Not panic. Not even anger. Not yet. Something quieter. The same feeling I get when I look at a spreadsheet and spot the row where the numbers were altered. The calm of someone who has just identified the problem and can now begin solving it. I asked Gwen to close the laptop, and I told her everything about the herbal tea. She stared at me for a long moment. Then she said, very quietly, that Derek had called her 2 days before I was hospitalized, asking questions about the business accounts. He'd framed it as concern. He said he was worried about me, that I'd seemed overwhelmed lately, and he wanted to make sure everything was in order in case something happened. He'd asked specifically about the wire transfer process and whether there was a secondary authorization requirement. She'd told him there wasn't. She hadn't thought anything of it at the time. I closed my eyes. I thought about my mother's face in her last weeks, the way she'd sometimes look at Derek with a sadness she never fully explained. She'd held my hand one afternoon and said, "Take care of what I leave you, Claire. Don't let anyone make you feel guilty for protecting what's yours." I'd thought she was talking about the family friends who might come looking for loans. I understood now she had been talking about her own son. I didn't confront Derek. I didn't call him. I didn't post anything on social media, or change any obvious passwords. I did exactly what I'd done when I first found out a supplier had been systematically overbilling me for 2 years. I gathered everything quietly, methodically, without tipping my hand, and I built a case. Marcus was an attorney I'd used for the business. He was sharp and completely unruffled by anything, which was exactly what I needed. He came to the hospital the next morning and sat in the chair beside my bed and listened without interrupting while I laid out everything I had. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he asked if I was certain I wanted to pursue this criminally, given that Derek was family. I told him Derek had poisoned me and stolen $61,000. Marcus nodded once, like I'd confirmed a prior hypothesis, and opened his notepad. He told me what I was dealing with. The unauthorized transfers constituted wire fraud at minimum, felony theft at maximum. If the toxicology came back pointing toward deliberate poisoning, and the hospital's preliminary findings were already trending that way. We were looking at assault with intent to cause great bodily harm. If the intent could be proven as financial gain, prosecutors would likely pursue attempted murder. I asked him what we needed. He told me we needed Derek to incriminate himself. We had the transfers, but a good defense attorney would argue my credentials had been compromised, that I'd authorized them while distressed, that my memory of the event was unreliable due to my medical state. We needed Derek's own words. We needed him to want something badly enough to say them out loud. Marcus made some calls. Gwen ran her own quiet investigation and found that the account receiving the transfers had been opened 11 days before my hospitalization, 11 days after our mother's estate was finalized and I received my portion. The timing was not subtle. Derek had opened a clean account in advance, then spent over a week introducing toxins into my daily routine, then waited for me to be incapacitated enough that he could move the money before I recovered. Except I had recovered. That was the variable he hadn't planned for. The toxicology report came back 4 days into my hospital stay. Elevated concentrations of a compound found in certain herbal supplements specifically, a combination that became dangerous at high doses and caused symptoms indistinguishable from natural liver failure in someone with no prior history of drinking. It wasn't exotic. It wasn't a masterpiece of planning. It was available online, inexpensive, and in quantities sufficient to make someone very sick for a very long time if they consumed it daily in their tea. The detective assigned to the case, a woman named Santos, who wore practical shoes and asked very precise questions, told me this was not the profile of a carefully premeditated poisoner. This was the profile of someone desperate, impatient, and not particularly clever. I thought about Derek asking where I kept my spare house key, and told Detective Santos I agreed completely. The trap was Marcus's design, executed with the kind of quiet elegance I'd come to expect from him. He called Derek and told him there was a complication with the wire transfers. The receiving account had been flagged by the bank's fraud detection system routine for large transfers, with no prior history, and the funds were temporarily frozen, pending verification. He told Derek that the funds would remain frozen until the account holder me formally authorized the release, or until the matter was escalated to a civil proceeding, which could take anywhere from 6 months to 2 years. Derek went silent on the phone for a long moment. Marcus told him there was another option. If I had, in fact, authorized the transfers myself, perhaps during a period of stress, perhaps in a state of mind that made the decision seem reasonable at the time, then a simple signed statement from me, confirming that authorization would release the funds within 48 hours. He told Derek that he wanted to help the family resolve this privately, that these things happened, that what mattered was getting it sorted without unnecessary scrutiny. Marcus was very good at his job. Derek said he would talk to me. He arrived at my apartment 2 evenings later. I had been discharged by then, under strict instructions from my doctor and Marcus both to appear exactly as vulnerable as I actually felt, which required very little acting. I answered the door in a sweater that was too big for me, and sat on the couch and let him look at me and assess. He sat across from me and did something I hadn't expected. He cried. Not the ugly, involuntary kind. The careful kind. The kind with just enough wet in the eyes to be convincing if you weren't watching closely. He told me he'd made a terrible mistake. He told me he'd been drowning in debt, which was true, and that he'd panicked, which was a performance. He said he never meant for me to get so sick, that he only meant for me to be out of it for a day or two, just long enough to move the money somewhere safe while he figured out how to explain it to me. I kept my face very still. I thought about the fact that he had just admitted to poisoning me and committing wire fraud in the same breath, in my living room, to what he believed was only his sister. I told him I was scared. I told him the police had been asking questions and I didn't know what to say. I told him I didn't want him to go to jail, but I also didn't understand what had happened to the money or why, and that Marcus kept calling me about authorizing something, but I didn't know if I should. Derek leaned forward. His voice shifted, the tears dried up, efficient as a tap being turned off. He told me what I needed to do was sign the authorization document. He told me it would make everything go away. He told me we were family, and family protected each other, and that if I signed the paper, he would pay me back gradually. He just needed time. He needed those funds to cover something urgent, and I had to trust him. I asked him what would happen if I didn't sign. He looked at me for a long time. The thing on his face in that moment was not grief, and it was not remorse. It was calculation. He said, very quietly, that it would be complicated. He said that people might start wondering whether I'd been responsible for my own condition, whether I'd been abusing supplements, self-medicating, making reckless decisions. He said these things had a way of becoming murky when family members started pointing fingers, and that it would be better for everyone if we kept it simple. He was threatening to fabricate a narrative to protect himself. He was threatening to do it to my face, in my living room. I nodded slowly. I told him I needed a day to think about it. I walked him to the door. I watched him drive away, and I stood in the doorway for a moment, with the cold air coming in, and thought about every cup of tea I had poured down my throat, believing it was kindness. Then I called Detective Santos. The conversation in my living room had been recorded by a device no larger than a USB drive. positioned between two books on my shelf by Gwen 40 minutes before Derek arrived. Every word of it was clean and clear and admissible. Derek's admission that he had intentionally introduced a substance into my food to incapacitate me. His threat to fabricate evidence against me if I didn't cooperate. His explicit confirmation that the transfers were unauthorized and that he needed the funds to cover debts. It was not a partial confession. It was a complete one. The arrest happened 3 days later at Derek's apartment. Santos told me it was straightforward. He opened the door, they presented the warrant, and he stood there for a moment, and then said he wanted to call his attorney, which Detective Santos said was absolutely his right. He didn't resist. He didn't yell. He just went very pale and very quiet, the way a person does when they realize the story they've been rehearsing in their head has no audience. He called me from the county holding facility that evening. One call. Permitted by policy. He didn't ask me how I was doing. He didn't ask about my health. He asked me if I understood what I had done by going to the police, and I told him yes, I did, very clearly, and that I hoped he would use his time in custody to develop a similar understanding. He started to say something else and I told him I had to go and I ended the call. Gwen was sitting at my kitchen table when I hung up. She looked at me over her coffee mug and asked if I was okay. I thought about it honestly and told her I was better than I'd been in 8 months, maybe longer. She nodded like that made complete sense. Derek's attorney negotiated. They always do. The prosecution held firm on the wire fraud. The digital trail was too clean, the timestamps too precise, the account too clearly premeditated. The assault charge required establishing intent, and the recording from my living room, combined with the toxicology report and the timeline of the account opening, made that argument relatively tidy. His attorney pushed for a plea to avoid the attempted murder charge. The prosecutor agreed, with conditions. Derek pleaded guilty to wire fraud, felony theft, and aggravated assault. He was sentenced to 9 years. He'll be eligible for parole after serving 6. If his behavior warrants it. The court ordered full restitution, the $61,000 returned to my business account, plus legal fees, plus damages for medical expenses that his deliberate actions had made necessary. He sat at the defendant's table during sentencing and didn't look at me once. I sat in the gallery and watched the judge read the terms, and felt the particular quality of quiet that exists on the other side of something terrible, when it is finally, completely finished. Not the quiet of an empty room, the quiet of a house whose alarm has been disarmed. A month after the sentencing, my mother's attorney contacted me. During the estate settlement, he had flagged some irregularities in certain communications, specifically 2 emails that appeared to be from me, authorizing changes to an account beneficiary designation. The timestamps on those emails placed them during a weekend I had spent entirely offline at a friend's cabin, with no cell service. Someone had been accessing my accounts well before the hospitalization, well before the herbal tea. Derek had been running a slower operation in the background for months, testing limits, seeing what he could move before I noticed. I sat with that information for a full evening. I thought about how long he must have been planning, how many mornings he'd handed me that tea with a smile and asked if I was feeling better, how many phone calls he'd made asking about the business with fake concern layered over actual inventory taking, how many times I'd looked at him and seen a brother in trouble instead of a strategy in motion. I won't pretend that didn't hurt. It did. It hurt in the specific way that betrayal by someone you loved hurts, not like a wound inflicted by a stranger, but like discovering that a door you trusted to lock had been open the entire time. The pain wasn't about Derek. It was about the version of Derek I had carried in my mind since childhood. The older brother who taught me to ride a bike in the church parking lot, who sat with me at our father's funeral when I was 11, and held my hand without being asked. That person had existed once, or I believed he had. What I understood now was that the debt and the desperation hadn't created something new in Derek. They had removed the covering from something that had always been there. That is the thing no one tells you about family betrayal. The worst part isn't what they did. It's the retroactive reinterpretation, every memory going back years, re-evaluated through the new knowledge of who they actually are. It's exhausting, and it's necessary, and you don't get to skip it. I did the work. I saw a therapist. I sat with the anger until it became something smaller and more manageable. I told the people who needed to know what had happened, and I stopped trying to manage Derek's reputation with people who asked where he was. Here is what I learned in the 18 months between collapsing on my bathroom floor and standing in front of my bathroom mirror one morning and recognizing something clear and unafraid in my own eyes. I'm going to tell you these things not because I want you to think of me as someone who survived something dramatic. I want you to hear them because I think some of you are currently drinking tea you should have poured out months ago. The first thing is this. Care without accountability is not care. Derek performed concern for years. He called to check in. He showed up for holidays. He asked the right questions in the right tone. But caring about someone without being honest with them, without taking responsibility when you harm them, without putting their safety above your own needs, that is not care. That is management. A person who genuinely cares about you does not require the version of you that is too sick to check her own bank account. Real care wants you present and awake and paying attention. If the people in your life are most comfortable when you're too overwhelmed to notice things, that is information you should take seriously. The second thing, trust is built from patterns, not declarations. Derek told me he loved me many times. He told me he would always have my back. Words are not data. Behavior over time is data. The pattern of Derek's behavior over the years, the loans that were never repaid, the explanations that never quite added up, the conversations that always circled back to what I had and how it could help him, that pattern told me everything I needed to know. And I had chosen not to read it because it was easier to believe the declarations than to face the pattern. I am telling you this because the people who will eventually hurt you are usually the ones who have been quietly showing you who they are for a long time. Let yourself see it. The third thing is the one that took me longest. Closing the door is not cruelty. It is not cold. It is not a failure of love. When Derek's first letter arrived from the correctional facility, I recognized his handwriting on the envelope, and I stood at my kitchen counter and I felt absolutely nothing that surprised me. I felt tired. I felt the weight of all the years I had spent giving the benefit of the doubt to someone who had been using that doubt as cover. I put the letter in a drawer. I didn't open it. I didn't burn it dramatically, because this isn't a movie and I'm not performing for anyone. I just put it away. Later that week, I threw it out with the recycling. If there is a version of Derek who is capable of genuine accountability and genuine change, the 9 years he has will give him the time to find that out. But he doesn't get to do that work through me. My capacity for grace belongs to me. It is not owed to the people who tried to take everything else. My business is doing well. Better than before. Partly because the clarity of that period, the sharpness that comes from understanding exactly what you almost lost, reorganized my priorities in a way that years of motivational podcasts never had. Gwen is still my partner. Marcus is still my attorney. I sold the spare house key to nobody, because I had the locks changed, and I have never given a copy to anyone I don't fully trust. Last spring, I visited the hospital where I spent 6 days with tubes in my arms. I left flowers at the nurse's station on the floor where I'd been admitted, because the nurse who first noticed my chart looked wrong was the person who called the toxicologist before anyone asked her to. Nobody does that in the movies. Nobody writes a script where the turning point is a nurse who looked at a number twice. But that's where it actually started, with a woman doing her job carefully and thoroughly, and me being lucky enough to be in her ward. I stood in the parking lot after, and thought about how close the margin had been. How many cups of tea I'd nearly had to drink. How many timestamps had almost lined up differently. I let myself feel that for a few minutes, because it's important to feel it, and not just move past it into productivity and lesson learning. Some things deserve to be held for a moment before you set them down. Then I got in my car and I drove home and I made my own tea. From a bag I bought myself, at a store I drove to alone. And I drank it standing at my kitchen window watching the neighbor's dog lose its mind over a squirrel, and it was the best cup of tea I've ever had. You are allowed to protect yourself. You are allowed to build walls around what you've worked for, around your health, around your peace. You are not obligated to stay soft and open for people who are looking at your openness and calculating what fits through the gap. Blood is not a debt you owe forever. Love is not a subscription that auto-renews regardless of what the other person does with it. If someone in your life has been very kind and very interested in your finances and very present when you're not fully yourself, pay attention. That pattern has a name, and it is not devotion. And if you are currently somewhere in the middle of it, if you are the one lying in the hospital bed piecing together the timeline and feeling stupid for having trusted, please hear me on this. You are not stupid. You were generous with someone who knew how to use generosity against you. That is their failure, not yours. The worst thing they did was not the theft, and it was not the harm. The worst thing they did was spend years making you feel that you were the problem, that you were too suspicious, too guarded, too slow to forgive, that your instincts were overreactions. The cruelest part of being someone's target is the way they train you to distrust your own perception. Your perception was right. It was right the whole time. Trust it now. I'm Claire. I built something from nothing. I almost had it taken from me by someone who should have been the last person to try, and I am still here. The accounts are full, the locks are changed, and I drink my own tea. That is enough. That is everything.